let us look at what happens right now in the TCG. That means we're going to talk about YCS Indianapolis. Once again, we were here the entire weekend. We've watched the entire action. Thank you everyone who was tuning in over the weekend. I had a great time watching the YCS with you all together. The viewer numbers have also been insane, so thank you again for that. It was an insane weekend. Let's talk about what happened, and let's talk about the format and what it means for the game moving forward for the current format. When we looked at the top tables throughout the rounds at YCS Indy, we already saw a super diverse format, and that's like one of the discussion points that's going around the Yu-Gi-Oh community right now. I think it's fair to say that like Pac sparked this discussion this time around. He was the first one to voice concerns with the format and be like, yeah, I don't actually like it. It's like very hard to prepare for, yada yada yada. I don't want to go into that particular discussion today because I've already spoken my piece on that during the weekend streams. It's up on the Plus channel, so on and so forth. We don't have to go into that at this point in time. I want to talk about the format itself because this is just the start of the format, right? So calling a format bad at the start, it's a fair opinion to have, but I think it's also worth pointing out that the format isn't developed yet. The format has just started. People have brought their first decks to YCS Indianapolis that they thought were good in the format, and that kind of perception of a format can change. And I think YCS Indianapolis, while it was expected to be super diverse and it brought a lot of diversity, also brought some things that people didn't necessarily expect, and that might change the way they pick their decks moving forward. So let's look at what happened exactly at YCS Indy. This is the top cut deck breakdown. Sinful Spoils Rescue Ace took up 37.5% of the top cut, which was 12. I want to talk about that because this is also the picture that was painted all the way throughout the Swiss rounds. Whenever we looked at top tables, it was always an incredible amount of Rescue Ace. Now, there is one unfortunate thing here, which is we don't know for sure how many Rescue Aces entered the tournament. Like whether this is an issue of, okay, Rescue Ace was just overall super represented, that's why it is so many in the top cut, or if it's decently represented and just converted really well into top cut, right? This stat is not that impressive if 50% of the tournament played Rescue Ace, which is probably not the case, but just saying we don't have that number for sure. I want to put some emphasis on the fact that I think this is an incredibly impressive stat. 37.5% in top cut might not seem that much in like a tier 1 format, or like when we had Sprite and Tearlaments being very powerful. In this current format, I think 37.5% is absolutely insane. It might not be as diverse of a format moving forward, because if Rescue Ace has this kind of result, if this kind of conversion into top cut, and not only conversion into top cut, it also had conversion within top cut. Both of the finalists were playing Rescue Ace. It's not like they got eliminated at some point through the top 32 because the deck isn't that great. The deck actually was able to convert, and I think at this point in time it's fair to assume that Rescue Ace is going to be the best deck moving forward, and that kind of statement means a lot when for like weeks now we didn't expect to have a best deck in the format, right? We had strong decks, we had top deck contenders, but we didn't have a clear best deck, right? Tearlaments was not the clear best deck, Unchained was not the clear best deck, Pearly was not the clear best deck. So many decks were viable, were strong decks, maybe even tier 1 decks, but you could not go out there and be like confident saying this is the best deck in the format. With Rescue Ace, with this performance, we might get to a point where it's the case, right? Where Rescue Ace is the best deck in the format, but the deck had some problems before the Sinful Spoils support, right? The two problems that the deck had were consistency and hand traps. The Sinful Spoils package solves both of those problems. Simple as that. Depending on how many you want to play, the minimum is 5 more starters, essentially. The thing is, the Diabellstar package are not just starters, but the fact that they also let you play through hand traps is insane. Someone in chat mentioned earlier, like, oh, the deck loses to Ash. It's not the case anymore. We saw it on stream multiple times playing through Ash. As long as you have an additional Sinful Spoils in your hand, you can pretty much play around all of the hand traps that you want. You can dodge Ash, you can dodge Veiler, you can dodge Imperm, because now if they Ash your emergency, you can still play. You can still get to your Turbulence. If they Imperm you early, you can dodge it with Emergence. If they don't Imperm you at all, you can just hold your Emergence to dodge the Imperm on the Turbulence. And if they then decide to Imperm your Turbulence on Summon, you can just Emergency for another Turbulence because you haven't used it yet, so on and so forth. And then there's one other thing that Rescue Ace has going for it. It has an incredibly amount of like different possibilities, right? You have like Terahertz lines, you have Synchro lines with Jet Synchron, you can go for the Eschatos thing, you have rank 4 access, you have Mud Dragon to protect from Impermanent Veiler, you can go for Heat Soul to draw more cards. You have a lot of flexibility when it comes to deck building to like decide what you want to go for. All these things combined make Rescue Ace a top tier deck right now, and honestly, probably the best deck in the format with a significant margin. It doesn't matter how diverse the format is, you resolve Turbulence, you're probably winning the matchup. And your entire deck is based around forcing through the Turbulence, which it does incredibly well now, and so it has a good matchup into a lot of different decks. There are bad matchups, not saying there isn't, but that is my first impression, is that Rescue Ace is in a way incredibly ignorant. It can basically ignore the fact that there's a lot of different decks in the format, because it's not one of those decks that gets completely carried by non-engine, because it just does what it does. It just does the Turbulence thingy, and that beats pretty much any matchup. There's exceptions, like I'm pretty sure Labyrinth is pretty good against Rescue Ace, but even that's not unwinnable. Everyone talking about Evenly didn't see Santoli's deck. That is the thing, right? I was gonna say the one weakness that Rescue Ace typically had or has, board wipes that wipe out the entire back row. Because of the importance of Turbulence, Lightning Storm, Feather Duster, Evenly are the kind of cards that you want to resolve against Rescue Ace because it takes away all of their back row. Just know for now, I think the strongest line so far is the Terahertz line that Steven played for good reason. With just one Airlifter, you get to summon Terahertz, you get Turbulence effect, and you get to add back a monster from your graveyard to your hand. So it in a way also provides follow-up. You can also go for the SP line. I mean, everyone is going to have SP in the extra deck anyways, but I think if you play this stuff, you would go for this stuff rather. Especially post-siding, where you can negate stuff like Lightning Storm evenly, so on and so forth. I think that's where this really shines, is being able to negate stuff that kills your back row. So the second place list is, I think, a good thing to quickly look at because it has a lot of things that are different from Steven's list that we can quickly talk about. So this is a list that in the main deck, it runs triple Diabell Star for more consistency and to also make the Savage Baron play more often. It also has the Jet Synchron for the Synchros. It has Super Poly for non-engine, and it has Proxy F Magician to make the combo where you make your Turbulence unable to be Imperm their Baylor. We got Pearly, which is very standard at this point. I mean, this is a super cookie cutter Pearly list. There's nothing special here, I don't think. We've got Tier. I feel like most tier limit decks without King of the Swamp have been looking something like this. I will say that I believe SP Little Knight is also a buff to danger cards, simply because with SP Little Knight in the mix, you finally have something. Any extra bodies you have, you can just sink them into SP Little Knight and it's going to be worth it. One other interesting thing to point out is the Shiyama here, because it's just a level 6. You can mill, you pop something, you bring it back, you make Beatrice. It's decent. You will notice that the non-engine tier, because you only have so little spaces, this is 41 cards, 6 non-engine, which is little compared to other decks. And that's why we're choosing to play very high impact non-engine. Nib and Super Poly, right? We have to take the risk of these cards being dead in a matchup in order for them to have any impact in other matchups. This is another Rescue Ace. There's so much Rescue Ace, man. There's so much Rescue Ace. This is the one with the Nemesis and the Eschatos. The way the combo works is you like make the Infernal Flame Banshee to search this, then you summon this out, searches this, and then you can use Reprodocus to make anything, you make it any type you want basically, and then you can call any type with Eschatos depending on the matchup. It's kind of cringe in a way, but it's also impressive. It's impressively cringe. Speaking of cringe, let's move on. I will say Labyrinth, I think, could be in a little bit of an upswing. I think Labyrinth is one of the few decks that has a solid matchup against Rescue Ace. Some of their back row you don't care about, right? Extinguish and Contain only work on monsters. You can let Rescue Ace do what they do, and then you set 5, and then you're probably okay, especially if you have Skill Drain. I think this version is a little bit weaker against the Steven Santoli list because you have a problem with the D-Save Worm Negate in the graveyard. That is an issue. But if your opponent is doing something like the Arc Nemesis thing, and then you just evenly them, you're fine. You're Gucci. Evenly is pretty good against some Rescue Ace versions, depending on what they do. I don't want to talk about this. I really don't want to talk about this. By the way, I think Sprite is one of those decks that has an issue with the format being super diverse. Because Sprite is one of those decks that is super adjustable, right? You can make a Sprite deck beat almost any matchup that you want if you just know what you're expecting, right? Because Sprite is just like super compatible with any sort of non-engine. You can throw anything into this deck, right? It can be board breakers, it can be hand traps, it can be a mix, it can be back row removal heavy, it can be going first, it can be blind second, whatever. Sprite can do everything, but it needs to know what to expect. I can probably make a Sprite deck that is teched out to beat Unchained. I can make a Sprite deck that is teched out to beat Rescue Ace. I can make a Sprite that's teched out to beat Pearly. I just can't make one that does all those things at the same time. We saw 2 Sprites in top 32, which is more than I expected, so that's good. And then we have Unchained. Let's look at this breakdown for a second and think about what it means. Second biggest deck, Pearly. I think Pearly had a decent showing at this event. I think Pearly was a solid option and is and will remain a solid option moving forward. I don't think the Rescue Ace matchup is 90-10 like Pack said. It depends on your build, of course, but I think Pearly is one of those decks that will struggle against Rescue Ace going second unless you hard draw the field spell. I mean, that's the thing, right? If Pearly opens the freaking field spell, it invalidates the entire Rescue Ace back row. So that's why I think moving forward, the standard should always be 3 field spells. No questions asked for Pearly. I think Pack even played Terraforming. On the other hand, if you don't have the field spell, I think the matchup is incredibly difficult. If they hit your Lily with Contained and your Pearly with Extinguish, you are literally not playing the game. If you don't have the field spell, or your field spell gets negated, which is what the Terahertz combo does, right? The Terahertz combo probably auto wins against Pearly. I don't think Pearly is the Hail Mary solution to Rescue Ace, but it's a good deck still. I believe Steven Santoli was the only one doing the Terahertz stuff. Maybe not, maybe someone else and we just skipped over it, but not everyone is doing it, is the point. And if your opponent isn't doing the Terahertz lines, then it's just as simple as activate field spell and cook them. Tearlaments, I want to say I've seen a couple tournament reports where people posted their rounds. There was a lot of tier at this event. Sometimes even they played against more tier than they played against Rescue Ace, which makes me think Tearlaments didn't really perform at this event. Because even though it is the 3rd most represented deck in Top Cut, I don't think its conversion rate was that good. I think the problem is after it's showing at YCS Dortmund, the deck is expected. We've seen so many dimension shifters in these side decks, or even main decks sometimes. People are specifically preparing for Tearlaments, and the deck is not as busted anymore as it once was. There was a time where Tearlament was so busted that even if people prepared for it, it didn't really care. It was just too strong overall. Those times are over, I think. It's really good against Unchained, and it's good against Pearly too. If there's other stuff in the mix that is prepared for your deck, I think Tearlament struggles. After being the most represented deck in Top Cut at Dortmund, and we don't have the exact numbers, but if I had to guess, I think Tearlaments was probably the most represented deck at this tournament. Maybe not more than Rescue Ace, but definitely more than Pearly. For that, I don't think it performed that well. Manadium, kind of impressed, unironically. It's only 2 in top 32, but it's kind of like a sleeper deck still. Like, not many people are playing it, and it's performing decently well. Sprite also, in my opinion, overperforming with 2 people in top 32. Did not expect that. Unchained, even more so than Tearlaments, I am disappointed by. Only 2 of them made top 32, which I find very, very few. It's at the same representation in Top Cut than decks like Sprite or Manadium, which I can guarantee you were played far less than Unchained. Like, Unchained was very popular at this YCS, whereas something like Sprite or Manadium was considered like a sleeper pick, like Rogue, and they still managed to top in the same amount. I think Unchained is one of the losers of this format. Like, I think Tier and Unchained, which is funny because they were the 2 biggest decks beforehand, I would argue. Like, from YCS Dortmund, like, most topping decks, it was Tier and Unchained. Like, those were the 2 that performed. Those were the 2 before this event where that's where it was at. And now it seems like those 2 have fallen off like a significant amount because it seems like Rescue Ace just does the mid-range deck better. And I don't think it's out of the question that we're going to be facing like a Rescue Ace tier 1 situation. The deck has been dominating the OCG too. Don't forget that. Like, pretty much the exact same deck that is the most powerful in the OCG for months now is now here and it's performing. People thought it wasn't going to be as strong because our format is different. You know, there's no max C, yada yada. But no, it's just powerful. I expect more people to pick up Rescue Ace now. I do expect it. I don't think it's a tier 0 situation though. I do want to emphasize that as well. I think Rescue Ace is a beatable deck. Like, the way I'm talking about Rescue Ace right now might make it seem as like, oh, I'm thinking it's completely broken and whatever. I don't think it's that. But I think it is. If I had a YCS next weekend, I would probably bring Rescue Ace and I would feel good about it. And I don't think I would be looking into most of these other decks into too much detail. I think Rescue Ace is looking really, really solid right now. I like a lot of the things it's doing. I like it a lot in theory. I like the amount of non-engine it gets to play without being reliant on drawing non-engine. I think Rescue Ace is pretty damn strong. The only other deck that I would really be interested in, but unfortunately, I don't think we have the list, is the Deception deck with the Gen and Ken. Out of the entire weekend, that was the deck I was the most impressed by in terms of the creativity, and Ed unfortunately did not make top 32. One other thing I wanted to look into, because we've been talking about this format so much now. There's another YCS in 2 weeks, YCS Richmond. Now that I saw this YCS, I'm even more hyped for that YCS. There's also one in Bolivia, but that's not getting streamed. But what I wanted to say is for YCS Richmond, we will also be here watching. I think I can only stream on Sunday, but I will be here for the Sunday for sure. The reason why I think it's so interesting is because we saw this YCS as kind of like, okay, first YCS of the format. No one really knew what was going on. People just brought what they thought was a good idea. We've seen the format unfold. We've seen it play out a little bit at this YCS. And now we have our stats. We've been making assumptions all day of like, okay, I think Rescue Ace is going to be very strong moving forward. People are going to look into Rescue Ace. And we're going to see if that's true at YCS Richmond.